What if you could help others to find the power to heal themselves, physically, emotionally, and spiritually?
When I started teaching my classes, it was in 2002, and I was just doing past life regressions and contacting the subconscious part. But then as the time went on and we found how powerful this was and what we could do with it, a lot of the students began saying, you know, advanced past life regression doesn't really tell what it's all about. This is so much more than that. We think you should change the name. So it was a few years ago, we decided to change the name to Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique.
Help other people to speak to their higher selves. You can. Dolores Cannon has taught thousands of people from across the world how to use QHHT. Now you can learn her method by going directly to themoreshow.com/QHHT. And don't forget to mention the discount coupon MORETALKS. Welcome back. My next guest is political activist Stephen Bassett. With a background in business development and a degree in physics, Stephen uses his knowledge to focus on the issues surrounding UFO phenomena. Stephen is now a leading advocate for ending the 64-year government-imposed truth embargo regarding an extraterrestrial presence engaging the human race. He is also the executive director of Paradigm Research Group. Stephen Bassett, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, Ken.
So Stephen, at age 49, why the massive U-turn into ufology?
It's essentially one of those midlife crisis things. Not uncommon for men to have this. Some men go out and buy a sports car. Some join the Peace Corps. I surveyed the situation and decided that I wanted to try to do something that I felt had larger purpose. There are many possibilities, but this issue had been with me for my whole life, but I'd never engaged it. It was kind of like a sidecar in the motorcycle, just kind of cruising along, but empty. And when I made the decision to do something, I looked in that sidecar. And what I found was John Mack. I read his book, Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens. And it was so clear to me that the entrance into this issue by a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who'd won a Pulitzer Prize was like a watershed thing. And I looked further and realized the issue had matured dramatically during my lifetime, and my life virtually parallels the whole UFO era, going back to exactly 1947, 1946, that I said, this thing is now real, and something's about to happen, and I need to get involved. And so I persuaded John Mack's organization in Cambridge to allow me to come out and work for them as a volunteer. I spent about 4 months. It wasn't really the right fit, but it was fantastic time. And it was while I was at Cambridge in my office there that I realized what I needed to do. And that was to go to Washington, where I had spent a lot of time, knew my way around, and engage this issue politically, because the solution to the UFO ET issue is in fact political, not scientific.
So in the political realms then, what did you become?
Well, it was interesting. I'd figured out that there really hadn't been a serious political engagement, and that there were a lot of interesting opportunities. First and foremost, I immediately registered as a lobbyist with the United States Congress after I founded Paradigm Research Group. That would normally not be a big thing, except no one had ever done it.
Yeah.
And I knew that all the lobbying registrations were carefully watched by the political media, because they want to know who's representing who, right, at any given time. Because lobbying's a big deal in Washington. And the moment my thing came across their desk, lobbying for the UFO ET issue and the ending of the truth embargo, they went, hello. And so immediately I got media attention, big article in the Washington Post and so forth, which got me into the game. And then a couple years later, I founded the first political action committee on this issue. Again, these are milestones. These are markers that are being put down.
Yeah.
It's what I call the process of normalization. The UFO ET issue had been ghettoized by the government as part of the truth embargo, which is to isolate it, ridicule it, separate it out. It's very nasty business. Governments do it all the time. And so it becomes a matter of ridicule. It's awkward. People laugh. It needed to be normalized because, in fact, it's just one more issue like many others, and it should be treated and dealt with like any important issue.
So, being having the sort of political activists on your side, I suppose it opened up the doorway for the media. I mean, that's where you really wanted to get into, didn't you, in the media?
Well, let's face it. For a lot of the media, it's a lot easier to talk to an activist who is speaking in the issue from a more political perspective than opposed to a researcher or an individual who's had a sighting or whatever. The science of this issue, ufology, had been going on for decades. I mean, going over and over the same territory. So there really wasn't a new story there in a sense, and they knew that. And the last thing the media wants is an old story. So the political engagement, on the other hand, and someone who can speak in those terms. In other words, I can speak just as easily about the Iraq War as I can about the ET issue, but my issue is the extraterrestrial presence. And so that language, and the other important thing is, the political engagement also led to the creation of new language, because in order to go in new places, particularly politically and sociologically, you need to have new language, and we've been creating new language since the early 90s.
But surely, though, the mainstream media does not take this subject seriously, even if you are a political activist. I mean, you must have been up against it quite a lot.
Actually, I have to disagree with you. The fact is that it's been changing very rapidly in the last 10 years for sure. The reason I know this is that one of PRG's principal tasks is monitoring the media. At my website, paradigmresearchgroup.org, there is a media archive section where there are 5,000 mainstream media English language articles that you can access through that section. 5,000. That represents maybe 1/5 of all of the English language news articles on UFOs since 1940s. That's a huge amount of coverage. In the last 10 years, the coverage has expanded dramatically, over 1,000 articles a year easily, maybe as many as 2. And maybe 1 in 100 of these articles you would call dismissively demeaning. A sea change has taken place. Now, that's because we're coming out from under the truth embargo, which has been in place for 64 years, but for the last 10 years is sort of limping forward.
Well, what is the truth embargo?
The truth embargo is a policy that was initiated in the early 1950s by the United States in cooperation with its chief allies, most of which we know who they are, including Britain, without question, that the reality of an extraterrestrial presence had to be maintained. It could not be acknowledged. There was no way to deny it. I mean, no way to make it a secret, because the ETs are coming and going, right? It's no secret. But you can control it, maintain it, keep it out of the universities, make sure it does, any of the work doesn't get funded by government, universities, whatever, philanthropists, and then contain the media. Make sure the media doesn't go too far, stays within a certain threshold, which wasn't that hard to do back in the 50s when there were only newspapers and 3 television networks. And so the media has been essentially part of the truth embargo. And while they have covered the issue, and actually fairly seriously in the early days, they will not cover it appropriately. What's appropriate? Simple. The United States declares war on Iraq. The next day, the story appears on page 10 in the New York Times. Obviously, that's ridiculous, right? That would be absurd coverage. That's the point. The ET issue is not being covered appropriately, and by not doing that, the embargo is easier to maintain. Now, what's happening is the media is coming up to the line now. More and more, they're coming up to the line, but they're not crossing it. But it's only a matter of time. Certain segments of the U.S. media are going to cross that line, and they're going to engage this issue, and the truth embargo could not withstand that for more than 60 days if that takes place.
But what are they trying to keep suppressed from us?
Oh, it's simple. The government's aware of an extraterrestrial presence. And they felt in the 1950s that it was simply not in the national security interest for this to be acknowledged. And the principal reason for that, it's not some exotic, crazy thing, no, is that in between 1947 and 1952, when this issue explodes on the scene and becomes a major problem for the government, at the same time, we are fully aware that the Soviet Union has atomic bombs. They've dropped them, 49. We know they're developing nuclear bombs. They dropped the first one in 53. They have their own missiles, their own German rocket science. And of course, we have an ideological divide that Churchill called what? An Iron Curtain across Europe. We were in the middle of what we called the Cold War, but as far as they were concerned in the 50s, it could go hot at any time. They were facing the potential for a nuclear war that could end civilization. And they felt that the extraterrestrial issue, if it were brought out, would just be too much, that it had the potential to destabilize things, someone make a miscalculation, get a little overwrought, whatever. In other words, it would overload the geopolitical stability. And so they made the decision for nationals. And plus, they didn't know the full details. They didn't know what these ETs wanted. They didn't know where they were from. They had ET craft that they obtained from crash events, but they didn't understand the technology yet. And so they made the decision. This has got to be embargoed. I'm not going to argue with that. I would have probably made the same decision. The problem is it's now 64 years later. The Cold War ended in 91, and they're still tied up, right? And it doesn't work anymore. In other words, this policy is now antiquated. Its shelf life is used up. We need to move on. And to move on, we must know about the ET presence.
But for the governments to come out to say they've been lying for 60 years, how does that work?
They're not going to say that.
Well, no. So
governments have excellent PR companies that they hire to help them. They're not going to come out and say that we've been lying for 60 years. They'll say, for national security reasons, we could not inform you of this prior to today, but now we feel that you can know this information, and so we are now bringing it forward. You see, they're going to put it, disclosure, which is the formal acknowledgement of the ET presence, capital D, it's an event, it's not a process, will be handled in a way which is in the best interest of the government. It'll be done in a way that sheds the best light on them. We will challenge that, perhaps. There'll be some debates and what have you, but the government's not stupid. And when they do it, you'll find it'll go fairly well for them, though they will have their problems.
So what would make the world governments come out to say that we've been hiding this? I just can't get my head around that.
There are many reasons. First of all, increasingly, every day, more people figure it out. The number of people right now in the United States and the UK that believe that the UFO phenomenon is ET in origin is around 50%. The number of people that believe the governments are lying about it is in the 80 to 90% range. It's not a secret anymore. It's out, right? We know that they've been lying. We know that they held it back. So in a sense, the cat's already out of the bag in a way. And the longer they refuse to acknowledge the reality, it undermines their credibility. The one thing we have noted with great interest over the last 20 years is the decline of credibility on the part of government. Trust in government in the UK, the United States, is at historically low levels.
But with situations like Roswell, they've always come back to say it was just a weather balloon.
Well, that was then, you see. That was then. The last time they came up with an explanation on the Roswell thing was 97. 14 more years have gone by. The Roswell case hasn't gone away. But here's the number one reason why the truth embargo will end. You remember the space race? When the United States realized it had a space race with the Soviet Union, it announced it in 62 and was on the moon in 7 years. We entered in an arms race with the Soviet Union. By the time that had run its course, we, between us, had 80,000 nuclear weapons. When nations get in competition with each other, it's all over. Well, guess what? Since about 2000, when the French government broke ranks with the truth embargo, essentially, by allowing the Cometa report to be issued by the Cometa Committee, which concluded that the extraterrestrial explanation is only one, and then a few years later started releasing its files by the thousands. The UK followed after that, and then it's Ecuador, Brazil, Mexico, Sweden, Canada, New Zealand. Thousands of files are being released. For the last 10 years, we're in a disclosure race. It's now a race between which country goes first. And the country that goes first will in that instant achieve one of the great political legacies of all time. And when it comes to those kinds of things, governments can be rather solicitous.
Well, Stephen, after the break, we'll get more into that. And stay tuned, and we'll be right back after the short break.
You're on a journey right now, a destination where you are headed full of adventure. And all around you are clues pointing you in the direction of your higher purpose and dreams. The signs and synchronicities can be seen. Whilst on a trip, at your local coffee shop, within your social networks. The road to your success and happiness is scattered throughout the pictures of our days. Simply make the connection, that's all. Channeling.com is your source for highly regarded spiritual readers who can direct you on your journey. Use the code TMS1 to receive a discount on your first reading.
Welcome back. I'm still joined by political activist Stephen Bassett. Now, Stephen, one of the questions I've been wanting to ask you on this ET embargo subject is, why haven't other countries come out? If this is a global secret, then why haven't, for example, India disclosed, or some smaller country that has less to lose? Or do they have less to lose?
Look, the full story won't be known until after disclosure. I mean, they haven't put any white papers out on this. We've had to try to understand it as best we could. But the initial embargo was put into place in the early 50s. The Robertson panel, late 52, was, I think, they cracked down. At that time, there's no question the United States was viewed with enormous respect. And its allies were going to go along with whatever it felt was appropriate. Plus, we were the only nation in the world capable of defending the West against the Soviet threat. And so what we said went, and we wanted this embargoed, and they said fine. So throughout the Cold War, through 91, no one should be surprised that our chief allies, UK, Canada, Australia, France, Germany, whatever, were fine. If you don't want this out yet, we're okay with that. Now, but what about the Soviet Union and Communist China?
Absolutely.
The answer there is pretty straightforward. Both of those were ideological controlled states, all right, based on complete loyalty to the state and its icons. And the idea that the Communist Party in the, say, Soviet Union was going to come public and say, guess what? There's other civilizations out there, and they're engaging us, and they don't know Karl Marx from Groucho Marx. Not going to happen, right? It would have been a huge threat to their control. And so they weren't going to do it. Now, after 1991, things changed. Soviet Union becomes 14 republics, Russia goes capitalist. Meanwhile, China starts instituting substantial reforms, still an ideological controlled state, but now a world superpower. All right, really. And so the basic reasons I've just given you are why things were contained through 91. Now, after the Cold War ends, it's not like it's going to just pop out right away. It was going to take some time, things had to come together, so forth. Well, we had the odd war here and there and all kinds of other things, and it got delayed. This is a whole other story in and of itself. But by 1999, the end of 99, I think our allies were starting to lose patience, and they started to break ranks, not by preempting us, but rather by pressuring us. And so all of these thousands of files that have been released by about a dozen countries since the year 2000, that's basically two things. These countries are putting pressure on the U.S. indirectly, saying we're not going to preempt you, but get on with this because we'd like to get on with civilization. They're also positioning themselves on the right side of the issue. So when disclosure does take place, the United Kingdom will say, well, you know, we were releasing files, we were trying to get the information out, we were doing what we could. The U.S., of course, because it's the leader here, has had to sit tight. It's not letting anything out. It's basically in until the very end.
So it could be a country like India, China, or some other country that does disclose in the
There
end?
are about 7 or 8 countries that I believe are at the top of the list. Right, and it's been changing time to time. Right now, I think the country most likely to disclose ahead of the U.S. is China.
But what would that do to their people or people across the world? But just concentrate on their people for a minute. Surely that would send mass panic around their country. Surely religions may have a problem with this as well. I mean, are you saying we're ready for disclosure?
Well, you say surely. Let me say this. Most of this you hear about mass panic and religious collapse and economic collapse is pretty much government propaganda put out there decade after decade by the government, whose job was to embargo this issue in all ways possible. Propaganda is a key element of a truth embargo. The economies are not going to collapse, religion's not going to collapse, and people aren't going to panic. In fact, I would say it's going to be almost anticlimactic. Everybody under the age of 20 won't even think twice about it. They're so ready.
What about those who think that our governments can't control our skies or are not in charge?
But you see, they already know that. Remember, 50% of the people in the first world, and in fact, a recent poll by Ipsos seems to imply that 50% of all of the world's people now know that there's a UFO ET connection, that ETs are here. And so you see, we already know they can't control our skies. We already know that we are engaging. And so what the government has all of that happening. In other words, they're taking the hits on that, but they're also withholding the truth. So they're losing on both sides. There's less and less of a mystery here. And so the government's refusal to disclose becomes not a defense of national security, but a major, how would you say, blemish on the social contract. It is undermining integrity. One of the reasons we're seeing trust in government collapse in the United States and being eroded elsewhere is because this big, vast lie is now so obvious, and it's wearing away at that trust every single day.
But where's your proof?
Proof? Proof of what?
Proof that there's an ET presence out there.
60 years of research by thousands of people. It's massive. There's a wonderful phrase that J. Allen Hynek used to give when he was asked that question, and this was 25 years ago. They'd say, Dr. Hynek, where's the proof? He'd say, where do you want me to back up the truck? It's everywhere. Go on the internet. There's over 4,000 books. There's video record. There's radar logs. There's photographs. Hundreds of witnesses coming forward. Pilot sightings. Thousands of pilot sightings. 30-inch, 60-foot disc off the cockpit window. How much do you want?
Well, my next question is then, and it's something I think about as well. If they did want to take over, they would have done that by now. If they did want to cause us harm, so surely they have other intentions.
Well, I tend to be circumspect here. Just because they didn't want to do us harm or haven't harmed us doesn't mean they won't do that tomorrow. Those that are trying to make the case for evil, destructive ETs have a problem because that's not supported by the past evidence. Those that want to be wary and be careful, I think that's appropriate. We do not know their intentions. Only they know their intentions. And we have enough evidence that is disturbing that we simply can't paint them as saviors or beings of light coming down to make everything wonderful. No, it is far more complex than that. And what I have said countless times in the nearly 1,000 interviews I've given since '97 is that if disclosure comes next week, over the 6, 8, 12 months afterwards, you are going to learn some things that are going to excite you, energize you, transform you.
What things,
You're
for
also
example?
Going to learn some things that are going to disturb you deeply.
Which are?
You're going to learn that ETs have been involved in genetic work with humans for a very long time. They take humans against their will into craft. They take materials from them. They are creating hybrid entities using our women. These are pretty significant things. Does it mean they're evil? No. There may be a damn good reason for it. Okay. They mutilate our cattle, which is not a huge thing. We mutilate our cattle. And there are contactees that have some difficult experiences, but there are also contactees that have amazing experiences. Guess what? The universe is not all black and white. It's not all good and evil. It's both. And the ETs are similar. Now, if there is a saving grace here, is that it's almost certain that given there are multiple civilizations out there,
Multiple races.
multiple. I guess if you grow up on a different planet, you're going to be a different race. There's almost certainly political alliances. Again, we have that all through our movies, whether it's Star Trek or whether it's Star Wars, whatever, political alliances. And so my guess is that what protects an early civilization like ours, a type 0, as Michio Kaku would say, from the Borg, is that there is a political alliances there that prevent a single civilization from going and doing great destruction, and that's logical, and I think is probably the
You
case.
think that exists? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So what you're saying that we're looked after by other races out there, most probably what you're saying.
There is a buffer, and it's the same thing on this planet.
Yeah.
What protects us from the rogue nation, from a North Korea? It is the political alliances that contain that kind of behavior. So I think we're
With their own
protecting that regard.
politics as well, with their own agendas
Yeah,
as well.
that's why we call it exo-politics, because one day it's going to be truly exo.
And very, very briefly, I mean, what sort of technology do you think our government's hiding from us that they've received from something else out there?
This is the big issue. There's no question that we have had crash vehicles in our possession for a long time. The evidence for that's pretty strong. We don't know how many. Roswell was a crash vehicle. Anybody that wants to make the case that the government got a crashed ET vehicle and then buried it in the ground so no one would bother it, make the case. I say they've spent billions of dollars studying it to the nth degree for 6 decades. We have good information that they have solved the anti-gravitic issue, and we have our own anti-gravitic saucers, human designed, human piloted. The question is, how much have they done with respect to the ET energy systems? Because those saucers aren't being powered by kerosene, oil or coal. That energy represents the salvation for the human race in the 21st century. If we don't have a major breakthrough in energy physics that allows us to drop the price of energy and stop polluting the air and the water through carbon-based fuels, the 21st century is going to be a disaster. 9 billion people living in abject misery. And I believe that is possible, and I believe that technology is being sequestered behind the truth embargo and not available because to do so would end the truth embargo, and they're not ready to do that
Okay,
yet.
so when's the truth embargo going to end? In our lifetime?
After 64 years, and given what I know and what I've seen and my colleagues, the truth embargo is ready to go at any time. It could happen tomorrow. There is nothing to prevent it from happening tomorrow, and not necessarily by the United States. And so what I tell people now is this: the truth embargo is going to end. It's inevitable. It will be soon. But the key question for us is, will it be soon enough? Will we make this transition before somebody nukes somebody, or somebody lets some virus out, or God knows, some other grotesque example of human behavior that takes us off into 25 years of darkness? That's why the advocacy movement is essential, not because it won't happen eventually, but because it needs to happen immediately.
And how can people support you?
ParadigmResearchGroup.org is a non-governmental organization. It is not a nonprofit, and that gives us more flexibility and makes it more difficult for the government to mess with us. Obviously, people can go to the website and support PRG as they wish. There are other groups out there that are also deserving of support. What we have never gotten is a major funder, because one of the key successes of the truth embargo was to ridicule and ghettoize the issue. So philanthropists and granting organizations, and of course the government, universities, can't fund it. It would be embarrassing, right? I mean, if this advocacy movement had a tiny fraction of the money that's been invested in saving the whales, we would have had the truth embargo ended years ago. So somebody out there has got to decide it's time for this truth to come out. I think the risks of engaging the issue are now nominal, and I think somebody will step forward, some major figure in the UK, the United States, or elsewhere.
Well, Stephen Bassett, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.